Okay. Well, my background comes from textiles and fiber art. And so the way I approach making art and probably the world is that I think about cloth as a second skin. And it's a place that holds memories and probably comforting for a lot of people, although not necessarily. But I think about how we experience the concept of memory through fabric and through thread and stitching. And so that approach is always important, whether it's more three-dimensional work or two-dimensional work, that it is a vehicle for communication in a really profoundly bodily and kind of very primal way. So when I make something that's three-dimensional, I'm usually, of course, much more aware of my body and space and wanting to situate the viewer in particular ways. And if it's like transmitters, the piece that's in the Biennial, it's also about inviting them to interact in a certain way, but with lots of possibilities. And that being pretty open. And I think even when I make things that are more two-dimensional on the wall, it's still kind of a three-dimensional approach because they're very layered, and I think about them still like cloth being the second skin, and the textures and layering is a very minuscule 3 dimensions. So I go back and forth, but that is my, I think, approach to the world. And also because it's how we experience lives as women and have always thought about the domestic sphere more and interacted there. And that's a stereotype, but I have really always been interested in how we can make the lives of women be brought forward more in invisible stories that can come forward.
This idea of how it's meant to be interacted with, we're meant to have that experience with the pieces. Can you, since we can't be with them right now, could you walk us through a little bit how someone might interact with that piece?
Sure. Can I give you just a little history on
yes.
how it's developed? So I had a wonderful opportunity to be on an artist residency in northern Thailand, just outside of Chiang Mai. I was at Nina Contemporary Art Space for 2 months in the winter of 2018. And I was so stunned with how beautiful the kind of umbrella skeletons of bamboo umbrellas, but without fabric on the top. They were sort of like not only skeletons, but a place that you could transmit and stand underneath. They looked like old satellite technology to me, and I'm really interested in sort of arcane technology. And so I was also feeling at the time that the membrane or cloth between myself and people who I love who've died, like my mom, was somehow much more available to me there. I was living in a bamboo walled, beautiful little small house on stilts, and you could hear everything outside. So it felt like the separation between you and the physical world, even when you were falling asleep, was much less than what I normally feel. Mm-hmm. And maybe it's also separating yourself from your life. You're able to focus and have some time. And so the first couple of nights I was terrified because I kept hearing this sound that I thought was someone walking, and maybe trying to get into my little cabin, which there were other people around, but I was alone and there weren't people super close by. And, you're just more aware. But I thought, well, there's something off. It's not the sound of an animal or a person stepping on something. It's the sound of something hitting the ground. And I realized it was the teak leaves. They're huge and they get dry and crunchy because I was there during the dry season. But they're really large and they make a big sound when they hit the ground. And it felt like this kind of reverberation of a voice from the dead somehow that was talking to me. And then lots of other ways. There was a beautiful little pond where the water was very murky. And so the fish came up, and they never really broke the surface. They just came sort of and then disappeared back down. And they felt like ghosts. They were really mysterious. So it's back to that same idea of trying to find really quiet moments in daily life that deserve more attention. And so the sound of the leaves falling to the ground and these sort of ghost fish made me feel like I was able to communicate, if it doesn't sound too hokey, that I was communicating with the dead in a different way, that membrane between the living and the dead was much less opaque. It was becoming much more translucent. And then I saw these beautiful umbrella structures that didn't have the fabric on yet at a umbrella factory, but it's not a factory in the way that you'd think of a car factory, for example. But everything's handmade, but it's, on a large scale of lots of them. So I saw a big pile of small umbrella skeletons together, and I was just so struck by it. And so I was able to work with the women who do the thread weaving on the umbrella that you see on the transmitter pieces, to work with them to make these skeletons, but specify the kinds of colors for the thread. So I wanted it to be like sunrise and sunset, and also sky. And when you stood under them, you felt like maybe you were transmitting or someone was transmitting to you. And so I had an exhibition before I left, and I had used small circles of cloth, strips of white cloth, and made them in a little circle like what you see on the base there, because I wanted to get everything home. Everything, like the umbrellas were collapsible. So these circles of cloth denoted a space that you would step inside of in the way that the base does now. And it still had that basket in the center with English and Thai inviting you to talk to the dead or listen to the dead, and take a piece of fabric and write it, whatever you chose on there. You obviously can keep as much private as you want, and then invite a friend to tie it on your wrist, because in northern Thailand and Laos, there is a tradition of having welcoming ceremonies or something at a wedding where you do this bacci ceremony where you tie a string onto the wrist and offer a blessing to the person. And so my Hmong friend Ia and her husband Tang did a bacci ceremony for Nelson and I at our wedding. And so one of the most memorable moments I have is of my mom tying, string onto my wrist. So, and so it would be typically that you'd make the cotton thread by hand, and it's put on a strip of bamboo and part of a kind of presentation at a wedding. But the bad spirit, you hold your hands out and the bad spirits are swept away, and then the good spirits are swept in. And then everyone ties, straight and offers you a blessing, and you can take it off for 3 days. As part of the bacci ceremony, you hold your hands out and the bad spirits are swept away, and then the good spirits swept in. And then everyone who's there takes one of the strings and ties it around your wrist and offers you a blessing, and you don't take them off for 3 or 4 days.
Cool.
And so you have this big kind of hairy wrist. Anyway, I thought that was really, just a wonderful gift.
Yeah.
And my friend Ia has passed away as well. So, and she was from Laos, and so it felt like it was a way to bring my, American and not that Ia was like my mother, but but friend, and that it was very linked to that experience for me. So it was really interesting. In Thailand, when I had the solo show, there were a group of students from Mass College of Art who were there, and they loved it. They jumped right in. They didn't have any qualms about, not interacting with it. And same with the, Thai people who were at the exhibition. And then I had a solo exhibition in Iowa with these pieces, transmitters, and I had done the bases now with the CNC carved text, which was the same on both pieces. I had a dream I could talk to the dead. Anyway, I have it written down. Oh, I had a dream I could talk to the dead, to my mother and father, my friends who died young. I had a dream I could listen to the dead in ghost fish, snail trails, leaves falling to the ground. And so when I showed it in Iowa, it was at a college, and the students there also really jumped in. And so it seemed like it didn't matter whether you were familiar with the bacci ceremony or, I was trying to be really respectful that it wasn't my tradition, but something, having been to Thailand and Laos 5 times now, I have been part of that. And so I just feel like it's a very grounded material way to suggest that when you communicate with the dead or listen to the dead, there's a physical kind of reminder. And, it's related to tying a string around your finger, or if you, things not to forget.
Right. I think that's it's very beautiful. Like, I love that it has, for you, it sounds like these kind of deeper, more personal meanings, yet, the audience and the people participating are also able to kind of dive in and have, create their own personal experience with it as well. And I think that whole story about the leaves, like listening to these leaves fall and having this kind of experience that's so specific to that place and being able to share that through that. So now when I think of the saying around the bottom and this idea of those leaves falling and kind of creating that otherworldly, maybe kind of feeling.
Or the snail trails, like I would go down, my studio was underneath my cabin. And so I'd go downstairs, and every morning there would be these beautiful little trails of slime from the snails. But they're really subtle, but they were like the most beautiful drawings on concrete. And so I felt like that was another very subtle kind of message.
So your piece is in a gallery entitled Pushing Materiality. And I know we've had talked a little bit previously kind of about your use of materials, and you kind of talked about how you approach textiles as skin, thinking about the way they use materials. But there's also like this, I think, connectivity throughout your work. Like, we just talked about connecting with the viewer in this kind of very visceral way. And I was just wondering if you wanted to talk a little bit, do you feel like that's something that is inherent in the materials? Like, which, almost like which comes first, are the materials kind of creating this, or are you imbuing these in the materials? But to me, it seems like it's almost inherent in the materials you're using.
Yes, I don't feel like I'm the author of what that message is. I think materials inherently have a message and a kind of juju on their own that that I want to be a partner with,
right,
in trying to help bring that forward in a way that might make it visible to other people where it was invisible before. So it might just be turning up the volume ever so slightly on something. Like with the thread weaving on the transmitter piece, when you stand under it, it's so beautiful to see those connectors, and it feels like, a net of communication of, but you don't see that as much when there's a, paper or fabric cover on it. Right. So like, exposing the skeleton of it, you're much more aware of then that potential for communication within those threads. In the same way, like I was also really lucky to be at a residency in Morocco, and when you're traveling, you're trying to think of things you can make that will be small that you can get back, but responding to the place at the time. And so this piece called Moroccan Book of Hours, and a number of other pieces since were based on Moroccan newspapers, but also my conversations with the women chefs, because I knew I wanted to do something with Moroccan food, and I bought a food dictionary, and getting to talk to them, and they let me cook alongside them to try to learn and the great thing about cooking is a lot like art making, whereas if you can watch someone and do it with them, you don't necessarily need the same language skills, right? It's um, and so by being able to layer the Arabic script of the Moroccan newspaper, but cutting out the English word for food I was eating each day, and I did a piece for each day. But like you were looking at it backwards through language. Oh, that's another thing that I always think of cloth as kind of the place where language meets the world, and your skin too. But it's as if, what does it look like inside your body before imagination has words or image or work? What does that look like? Well, nobody knows what that looks like, right? But that's I get to just try to figure that out and present something. And if it is that membrane, if cloth and skin is that membrane where language bubbles forth, then it's like it's the backside of it, or it's just as it's forming. So those Moroccan pieces were pretty literal that way, and that the English was backwards, as if you were standing at the backside of the word, trying to see through it, like you were inside your body, looking through the word as it's coming forward, trying to learn those Moroccan words for my new favorite foods.
You talk a little bit about, I think there was a comment in your statement about hearing the dead in images. And I was wondering if you could expand on that maybe a little bit as well, specifically with kind of more related to the idea of the images, hearing the dead in images.
Well, the ghost fish was one, and one kind of image that kept coming back, but also because water is everywhere in Thailand. There's just lots and lots of water, and also lots of events that are around water. So I was lucky enough to be there for the where people create or buy little tiny boats made of flowers and leaves with candles on them. And you go and collectively there are thousands of people lighting the candle and sending their sorrows, or want to let go of, on the little flower boat and send it down the river. And apparently the river mother takes all of those and sweeps them away. Wow, that's a lot for the mother. Because if you're a mom, you're like, wow, this one is, trying to. And so I did a piece called Mainam, or River Mother. It was kind of based on that experience. But that image of light, and so trying to think of like a presence under the water, but also the light. So that was a different, really long, paper piece. Also using butterfly pea flower tea to stain it, and some of the coffee I was drinking. Because also I find it's really interesting if you don't have supplies, like what can you use? What can you use? I'm really interested in working with new materials all the time. And there's kind of a downside to that because you don't necessarily know all of what it will do, but really get to play with it. And so I was also using my coffee filters because I felt like they kind of looked like the big teak leaves. They weren't as big. So I opened them out and brushed some of the coffee off and started using medium on them and made a piece that was like teak leaves falling to the ground.
Oh, pretty.
That was stitched just ever so slightly to hold them together. So when I say an image, I don't mean like a photographic image. It's more like a sound can trigger something, like the sound of the teak leaves. So it wasn't the way they looked on the ground so much as how the sound made me want to do something. And I did another large piece with stitched pleats down the side of hemp, which is grown there and used a lot. And the image of a tree bark texture down the middle of it, but then cloth that's wrapped around it is a way that people in Thailand indicate you can't cut this tree down. It's a beautiful old growth teak. And so a lot of times it's a monk's robe. It's the old frayed monk's robe. And I thought that was really beautiful. So they would be saved from not being cut down by this cloth.
So kind of one of the things that kind of, it sounds like one of the things that you want to do with your work is create that space for people to pay attention, to feel the experiences that they're feeling. Um, you also talk about like drawing attention to um, materials in the domestic sphere. I don't know. I think those things probably are related in some way. I don't know if you wanted to expand on this idea of the domestic materials a little bit.
Sure. I mean, I think there's an inherent feminism in trying to suggest that, these materials are equally worthy of value as is oil paint or bronze or any traditional art material. And so in my education, that was definitely one of the things that I um, thought about a lot, was that it was kind of elevating uh, uncommon materials, or well, common materials, actually materials that are in everyday life. And it's interesting how still some of my favorite artists like Mark Bradford use hair perm papers, because he was raised with his mom in the hair salon. I really am drawn to people who transform materials that are, common everyday materials. And I feel like that makes the art more accessible, maybe, that it because the material, if it's still recognizable, is familiar. And so it's maybe not quite as distancing as some traditional fine art materials maybe are, that viewers don't feel as intimidated by what is it supposed to mean, or it just means whatever you want and how you experience it.
Right.
I certainly have some impulse and intention for sure, but that doesn't mean you'll ever know my personal story with it. There's often many very personal stories, but I wouldn't even want to share all of those. So I try to allow for an ambiguity. That's why I'm not particularly interested in representational imagery, sometimes photographic imagery, but I change it.
Yeah.
But something that's much more abstract and open so that people can find their own interpretation.
Yeah. Well, the Biennial is, the Mountain Plains region, and part of the goal of this exhibition is to celebrate the work that's being created within the Mountain Plains region. So I wanted to know if you had any thoughts about what it meant to be an artist working within this region, if you feel like it's different than working other places, or if there's something, I don't know, you know what I mean?
Yeah. So I was raised in Kansas, and then I lived other places for 25 years, mostly gray northern cities, like Providence, Seattle, and Detroit. And and Detroit is so fascinating and filled with incredible crusty material and rust, and I was really inspired by that. But when we moved to Kansas in 2007, I was reminded how much I love the openness of the landscape here, and just how it's kind of the perfect existential landscape. Sometimes you'll see a single lone little tree,
Right?
which is a terrible stereotype, but sometimes it's true. It's like, oh, you can feel that kind of like loneliness, or that it's a far more complex landscape than just boring flyover country, and that there's tremendous subtlety in the prairie. If you look at a single square foot of prairie, it's amazing in its diversity.
Yeah.
And we've certainly created monoculture agriculture, which is more boring, but the sense of open space and not feeling penned in is something that has been really important to me. And then the other thing I say is being far from a really huge art community like New York, or even Detroit, which has an amazing art community, really incredible.
Yeah.
Just the sense of open space, being able to really not feel confined. Love that sense of being able to see a long way, and also being far from a large art community. Like Detroit has an amazing art community, which I do miss sometimes, but having hundreds or thousands of voices also makes it a little harder sometimes to know your own aesthetic voice. And a gift like a residency in another country, especially the one in Thailand where I was very much able to be silent and listen to my own voice. I think that's maybe easier to do away from a large art center, and I like that a lot.
Yeah.
And not having to spend so much time in the car, or just life is a little more able to be focused on your artistic practice and studio
Yeah.
practice. I think that really helps.
We're obviously in this very different kind of environment right now with the COVID-19 and people, spending a lot of time in their homes. Is there anything that you're doing right now that's maybe related to that? Or since we're kind of stuck in this kind of position, is there anything that you're doing, like working through our current crisis, I guess?
Well, it does feel like it's an important time to reach out to friends and family that you don't see a lot, or hear from a lot, and so that's been really nice in a certain way. I don't think I'm good at keeping up with people at a distance. And this is my studio, and I feel like I've done more in some ways, but also sometimes you question like whether it's just a selfish, kind of preoccupation. But I don't think that, because I feel like art has something to offer, especially in these times.
Right.
But I'm not doing anything based on it. I am actually making face masks. I'm sewing face masks, but I'm making them all one of a kind, and of course, ridiculously time consuming compared to what, because my digital embroidery machine I got with the Earl project. So I'm embroidering text on them and making really interesting color combinations with hand-dyed fabrics that I have. But that feels good to be able to do that for people that you love. And I made some for hospitals, but I also recognized that they need lots of them.
Yeah.
So I tried to, when I gave some to the one at Newton Hospital where our family's farm is that we are trying to renovate, and said, thought maybe it would feel special to have something really different if you're one of the healthcare workers.
Yeah.
And that was really satisfying. They
Yeah.
really loved that. And so but I feel like that it can bring out the best and the worst in people. And
I think we're watching that unfold.
yeah, not trying to get political or anything,
Right.
but the response, and the preparation, it is really kind of terrifying some days. And so that can have a really chilling effect on being creative.
Yeah.
But also, trying to find ways to reach out and tell people that you're thinking of them.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, that you kind of talk about that. Like I feel like one of the responses that I've had is this urge to talk to people that I maybe haven't talked to in a year or two. Like, yeah, like there's this, I have to talk to this person. Like, it's just been kind of interesting because I'm generally a homebody and I'm very introverted, but so I thought like, oh, this will be fine. I'll just be at home. And I'm like, oh no, I really need to talk to that person. So yeah, it's been an experience. But
yeah, no, it's really nice to check in with my college roommate from Denmark that I hadn't been in touch with until just like when I was in Thailand. Actually saw a message that she sent me on Facebook from a while ago, but so just being able to check in on people around the world feels good. But it's still more